There's other dynamics as to why they're successful or not successful that aren't just about skills. As you start to really go down this kind of skills first, skills-based journey in an organization, it's just not straightforward. Skills data works great in talent marketplaces, and I think it's the currency for those platforms. But skills data in terms of how you're going to run talent is not really what you're after. What you're trying to figure out in those discussions is, I'm a business who needs outcomes, and I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to do it. If it's a person, great. If it's an AI bot, also great. But the point is, I have a ton of outcomes I need delivered. HR, tech, can you help me do that? And suddenly you realize the discussion is different.
Hi, I'm George LaRocque, and I'm looking forward to exploring the critical trends shaping the future of work and technology with you over on the Work Tech podcast. Now, this podcast is a little different. I bring together industry leaders, innovators, and investors, and we go deep into market intelligence that matters to HR pros and tech providers alike. So give the Work Tech podcast a listen here on the Work Defined Podcast Network, and please subscribe if you like it. See you there.
Welcome back to the Meg and Amy Show. Thank you so much for the support for our show. Please do like and subscribe and add comments. We would love to hear from you and what you'd like to see more of on the show. Today we are interviewing Angela Mathon. Angela is founder and chief AI officer of People Alchemy, an advisory firm helping leaders design future-fit operating models at the intersection of people, intelligent systems, and organizational design. Previously, Angela was an executive in AI, people analytics, and workforce intelligence at storied organizations like GSK, Aviva, and HSBC. A recognized thought leader, Angela has spoken at Stanford, London Business School, Northwestern Law, CIPD, and People Analytics World on the future of work, human AI collaboration, and workforce intelligence. Welcome, Angela.
Happy to be here.
So before we dive into the meaty topics of the day, I understand that though you're an American, you spent like 15 years abroad and have recently come back to the US and maybe experiencing a little bit of culture shock. Tell us a little more.
So I kind of recently came back in around June time of this year. And I think what I'm realizing, even though I, grew up in the U.S., particularly in New York, when you spend a lot of time away, you pick up different habits. And I think coming back here, I'm starting to feel a little bit overwhelmed. I think having spent 10 years in London, 5 in France, it's just a slower pace. Things are sort of not as readily available, things take longer. And I think I sort of got acclimated to that gear. And now I'm back in the U.S. and it's like we are in... like boom, boom, like we are all in. And so I just think the pace of everything is just, I'm still adjusting to all of that.
Are you finding us all too loud, that we're loud and fast and all of that?
I just think it's in the US, I think, it's the type of environment where experimentation and freedom of everything is just all in. And so I just think, I guess you realize or appreciate the differences when you're sort of away and you don't have that. So I think, I'm experiencing just all of the beautiful things about being American all at once.
I spent 2 years in France myself, and I definitely had a culture shock when I came back as well. It was just, everything was really slow in France. I got back and I was like, oh my God. All right, so you have a fascinating background. In addition to all of the locations that you've lived, you found yourself in the analytics space, even kind of early on before analytics took off. How did you get there? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I think it all happened by accident, like maybe a lot of great careers maybe do. I found myself working in. So I would have been at this time, I was in France, and I was kind of like, trying to figure out sort of like this thing to do. And, as you're studying abroad and, you're trying to, get a sense of opportunities. And it just so happened that I found an opportunity to work in marketing analytics because I had a marketing background and consumer behavior, and I'd done some analysis work, but it was like, hey, the shtick was, The HSBC had acquired a bunch of, like, a really beautiful local French bank, and the whole thing was focusing on customer service, because this particular bank, was like, customer service is really important, and obviously in a market like France, you have to actually teach it because it's not necessarily an international known thing. And so I found myself working in a kind of retail environment where we're doing a lot of studies on kind of just, international behaviors and appetites. And so it's basically a situation where you're almost educating sort of a French teller how to sort of engage with international clients and how to identify them as clients. And so we had some behavioral dynamics where, international travelers would show up to the bank and the French are like, I'm not letting you in. I'm not going to service you. You don't look like what I identify as a banking customer or a premier customer, whatever the case is. And so I spent a couple of years helping support the analytics and telling the narrative and, doing a lot of work on mystery shopping. But that's kind of my foray into sort of the analytics world. It was the storyteller, because I was a student, I had just graduated, and I was in a situation where they were like, we need French speakers, but who also understand what the American understanding is of customer services, who could help us train, if you will, and upskill the French population, the French employees, to help them understand why this is important.
Great grounding, because you get both the deep understanding of the business side, but also the sort of human and customer clarity really early. I think that's got to be the best foundation for analytics, because you're actually able to think in terms of all the different personas that matter for the business.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think you're in a situation where the analysis that you're looking at and you're working on, you're applying it right away. So it's not just about the insight, it's how you action it, it's how you actually do something with it. And so I think that's the first relationship where I started to kind of understand the connection of, it's not just this pretty report or an analysis and then you sort of, pass it to someone else and you're not bothered. You're like, oh, I did my job. You're having to also understand that the way in which you tell that story needs to be done in a way that someone receiving it can action it. Otherwise, it's like, oh, that's nice to know, but so what? So I think I really got into the so what aspects of that and the commercial aspects of how you need to tell a story for it to be usable. So yeah, it was a very interesting experience.
And so then you found yourself in people analytics in the HR realm, and things really took off from there, right? You've been posting a little bit about some of the frameworks and the evolution of analytics to AI, including a recent lecture that you gave at Stanford, where you talked about how things are going from what's happening to what's possible. Do you want to share a little bit about this framework that you have and kind of how your thinking has evolved accordingly?
Yeah, sure. So having now done people analytics in particular for about 10 years, what you kind of find yourself doing in that role is you're basically relying on historical trends and making an assumption of, if those trends continue, this is what the world looks like. And it's hit or miss, right? And oftentimes, if you're looking at it in an aggregated fashion, there's a lot of the narrative that you sort of miss. And I think what I found myself experiencing in my last role is, Gen AI came on the scene like November time-ish, where we had access to tools. And we were in a situation where my team was able to sort of build customized products. And when you're now able to not only sort of build customized products, you find yourself now telling a different narrative as a result of the type of insight you're getting. So you're no longer just in the room and saying, here's a trend and I'm predicting what a trend could be. You're now in a situation of saying, I have a bunch of employee data, we've analyzed it in a different way, and now here's what we're actually learning about data that we never could have explored before. And so because you have now a new lens on a lot of data that was typically really hard to get to, you're in a space of what's possible. What does this actually mean? I haven't seen this before. I'm almost rediscovering my org. And so as fascinating and as interesting as the predictive narrative is, and I'm not saying it's not, and companies still very much do that, there's a depth that you're picking up with generative AI. There's a depth that you're picking up with how you can start to string some of these sort of data sets along. That means you're able to see your org in such a different way. And now it becomes, okay, so what's possible now? Now that I'm seeing my org, now that I'm actually making more sense of the data, I'm able to visualize data in a way that I just haven't before. What does that mean? How do I use that? When I'm generating new forms of content, right? you start to now imagine, do I always need a human to generate that? Can I get a situation where the system is generating it and maybe the human's a checker? But suddenly this becomes a possibility. And so I think that's what's kind of evolved, is that the modern version of AI that everyone's able to sort of experiment with has created an opportunity where the analytics person, who has always understood sort of like traditional forms of AI, they're kind of really able to upskill quite quickly into modern forms of AI and start to experiment and create data products. And so I think what you're going to start to see, if you haven't already, is a lot of these analytical leaders no longer just, I need to go and procure or work with a vendor, or I need to turn something on in a particular platform. They're actually saying, I can create my own data solutions. I can actually create my own data products because there's more safety, there's more security. I can control the black box narrative by adding a white box wrapper. I mean, there's so many ways in which this is kind of exploding, and so I think that's what's exciting right now. So I think that's what I was trying to point to the students is to say, as you're coming into this analytics role, don't think of it anymore as just, I'm here to analyze historical trends and tell a narrative of like, yep, let me diagnose what's happened, with the view that should you continue, the trend will persist. It's like there's another part of the story now, which is, there's actually all this new data, and I'm actually able to analyze these large data sets in a different way, and I'm discovering a new trend. I'm discovering new things that just says, hey, what do we do with this? And I'm also in a position to say, well, if certain aspects of a role can now be kind of automated or can be sort of broken down into sort of a new different components where you've got an agent now that can pick up aspects of it, then that changes a lot of how we have to think about analysis, even in terms of an employee population, because I'm no longer just going to be analyzing a whole fully human workforce. I'm actually now analyzing a hybrid workforce. So I just think there's a ton of opportunities that have kind of emerged since this modern version of AI has kind of shown up.
Just staying again with this context of somebody whose job and expertise is in data analytics, as I see it, this particular discipline has really evolved a lot over the last couple decades. And one of the things that I think that you're describing is really kind of like the next evolution of this particular discipline. And what I mean by that is, we are starting to create more of a hybrid kind of a role with a more hybrid and fulsome set of expectations, where before we might have split an analytics group to somebody that has context, defines requirements, thinks about what kinds of things you're looking for, someone that has technical chops and math, right, that can gather the data, make sense of the data, turn that data into something that can be understood, and then someone, and maybe those are again kind of shared roles, define the storytelling and the action list of what does it mean, what does it mean for me, and then what, and then what, so what, exactly like you described. And so now we are in a moment where the barrier to being able to understand and do all of that work is actually being reduced because of the tools that are available and the technologies that are available. And so as you think about that, I imagine we come up with a much more hybrid role, and as well as a higher expectation of the people in those roles of being able to understand a sufficient level of context, math, and storytelling skill to turn that into something that is useful within an organization. Is that how you see it, or do you still see that for a single person to have that hybrid set of skills, that's often going to be difficult to find in a single package of a human?
Well, I think if I can describe kind of my team setup prior at my previous company, right? So I had a person that was very much my data platform person, my data governance person, and obviously, analytics, AI, data pipeline, data governance is like, 80% of the work, right? So I had someone who's really good at getting that part of the story together. And then I had a person who was very much focused on digital products, right? Because you have to distribute this. So once you sort of get the data, you need to distribute that. And that's the person who's helping me figure out, how I build dashboards, how I create a user experience, all the rest of it. And then to your point, like you mentioned, I need someone to analyze these large data sets. And so I had my data scientist, my AI ML folks, right? But they're basically looking at data in a new way. But they're also in another way creating kind of bespoke data products. And then my fourth bucket was my behavior scientist, because I'm looking at people data and I need a people narrative and I need to understand the patterns, right? I can't just apply a quantitative lens. I need someone with a bit of a social dynamic, right? So my team, right, was comprised of sort of this construct. Now, if you spoke to them individually, because they're such strong SMEs in what they were doing, they can't bring a narrative to then my CHRO and say, actually, here's what's important, because all four of them would be like, well, all of it's important. and so they're right. And so having context is difficult. So I think what happens is someone like myself and many of my kind of analytic leaders like myself are able to look at those four sort of disciplines and bring them together in an interesting way that says, actually, given the business strategy, given the sort of, priorities of HR, and given what's important, actually the story here for us is this. And I think someone like myself was also in a position to say, and given the priorities of the future, these are the priorities that each of those different areas and disciplines need to sort of pay attention to. So I do think it's not that I'm an expert in all four, but having sat in those chairs in different parts of my career, I know enough to be dangerous, but most importantly, I know how to integrate that into a cohesive business narrative. And I think that's what companies are looking for, this idea of applied AI. So I think what I was doing previously was almost applied analytics. It isn't just that I'm, analyzing something. I'm applying it to the business to say, and here's why it's important. It's like that so what narrative again, right? Similar idea here. It's like applied AI. So you have a lot of people running AI initiatives, turning on AI solutions, but when you're not in an applied dynamic, getting the value part of the story becomes difficult. It becomes, I really know how to explain a model, I really know the ins and outs of the technology, and all that's great. I just haven't figured out how that translates to any sort of value for the company, and that's the blocker, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really beautifully put, and I'm so glad you described your organizational structure and so on. And so basically kind of your skill set has been a bit of a unicorn in the past. And what we're seeing, or what we've been discussing, is that actually everyone on that team now needs to develop that broader skill set. So they're still an SME in terms of what they can bring to the table, but they need to have that broader viewpoint to completely understand the context of the other three and, of course, the overall business strategy. Otherwise, those individuals are going to get kind of commoditized into, a very narrow rut that isn't going to serve them well going forward. So basically, everyone needs to become an Angela. Good luck.
Yeah.
But I think to that end, I think what you're seeing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as you work with clients and as you start to notice patterns, it feels to me like you're starting to see that awareness is really being unlocked. But instead of just being unlocked as a people analytics problem or a marketing analytics problem, and again, those are big problems, obviously. They've built a great career for you. But now I think people are seeing that as a broader strategy challenge for the business. How do I think about my business differently based on what is possible? How do I understand it with more depth based on the access to data that I have that I never used to have? And to the point of the prediction side, how do I look at the future when the future is not going to look like the past? So it's not necessarily going to trend from data, looking at it in the way I have traditionally. It needs to be discovered based on looking at the data that I have with an eye to where is the change happening and what is the strategy growth that we're looking to drive. So give us a little bit of like, when did this unlock for you that, hey, there is a pattern that you have seen in this analytics world that is very similar, but also at another higher order level of problem space, that organizations are starting to recognize they need that discovery, support, and help to figure out what they should be doing next. When did that come up for you?
Yeah, so I think what ends up happening is when you're in an analytics role, right? You're constantly being asked, can you go investigate a thing? Can you drill down into something, etc. Right? And so you go and you run around, you do some work, and you come back with a narrative, and then you get the question of like, okay, well, that's really all fine and well, but like, what are your recommendations? And so you get asked to then kind of do some sort of predictive, prescriptive, and try to come back with a thing. And then someone's like, okay, yes, but like, how do I know for sure? And so you find yourself in a situation where there's just constantly a need to say, well, is there more? Because, getting the insights and sharing it and always telling the story of here's what I'm finding and here's what you could do, it wasn't sort of sufficient. It was like, well, you're giving really high level recommendations. I think there was an appetite to say, well, could you go deeper? Since you're closer to the problem and you're seeing what it looks like, can you go a bit deeper into how you sort of, recommend we deliver it? And then we would say, that's not our job. You need to go into the business or to the area that, we've identified as, important to look at. And then when you would drill down into those areas, they either didn't see the data that way, weren't looking at it from that lens. And so you have that macro dynamic at play. It was just kind of at an impasse. And then fast forward, we get our hands on more data, and now because we're sort of, with a certain skill set, we're now able to drill down in a way where we kind of go, ooh, we've identified something from a particular lens, and we're like, well, actually, this is the art of the possible, now that we're looking at the data like this. And so now we're able to show up with a very, almost a very rich narrative on not just diagnosing a thing, prescribing something, but also providing a lot of detail as to where in particular of a process that you can actually start to influence and change, and you can make recommendations that are much stronger. And so I think that's the kind of unlock when you started to realize how people were reacting to it, going, oh, that's really, really helpful. And so I think that was some of the opportunities that kind of emerged sort of organically. So I'll give you a very simple example. Culture for many large organizations becomes really, really important, right? Culture work, it's a board mandate. It has many implications beyond sort of what you can imagine. And so how you diagnose culture in a global firm is very complex for multiple reasons. You rely on a lot of input. Your employee surveys becomes a big part of that. And some companies, depending on how global you are, you have some mechanism for translating survey data in a form. So we found ourselves in a situation where we were able to translate that information into a lot richer text that was giving us a context that we just didn't have before. And that information became something that was driving a much richer conversation at a very granular level because of how we had structured some of the questions. And so having that available plus other additional data sets means that the type of kind of recommendation and the type of monitoring that we can do on top of it, which is something that's very different than we had in the past. And I think that's what changed the conversation from simply just sort of, okay, produce some insights and maybe give me some recommendations, into sort of getting into a much richer conversation of specifically this particular area. If you make these changes, we can not only expect a certain result, but we can actually monitor. And I just think, you got into a dynamic that isn't always the case. It's like the strategic bumped into the operational in a way that just hadn't happened so simply before.
So, Angela, you've been advising CHROs on data and analytics and AI, both internally and now as an advisor as well. And I'm seeing that they are getting a lot more pressure from boards and CEOs to come up with AI adoption strategies and results. So what do you advise in terms of how to approach, what to focus on, what not to focus on? Like what's your advisory? What are your advisory tips?
I mean, every company is at a different stage, but I think probably there's maybe a couple things to keep in mind as you're sort of thinking about it. I think one, needs to be an appreciation that AI is a capability. AI isn't just LLMs. It isn't just sort of like modern versions of AI and experimental versions. So I think to keep it simple, there has to be an understanding of, are you in a situation in your company where people trust the data? Without getting any simple, right? But have you built in trust in the data? And if people trust the data, then they probably trust the trend of the data, right? And if they trust the trend, then the opportunity to start learning from that trend and using that as an input to then sort of guide future trends becomes a good foundation. So I think for any senior executive really thinking about AI, some of the questions to really start to get your head around is, do I have an organization where people trust data? And if they trust the data, then how I start to leverage that data as an asset begins to give you a foundation for how you can start to leverage AI. I think if you don't have trust in the data, it becomes a little bit complicated to do that, because showing up tomorrow and saying, hey, I built a recommendation engine off of your data set and it's going to now tell you to do a thing based on company data. Well, you're like, I don't trust this, so I don't trust the recommendation. I'm the expert. I've been doing this. And so you're going to have a bit of that attitude, right? So I think, you got to keep it simple, but there has to be this element of trust. And then I think if you then start to get into sort of more sophisticated forms of AI on the journey, I think the other thing I would say is Gen AI is, it's attractive and it's great, but don't confuse personal and consumer AI with enterprise AI. I think make sure you understand that there's two different things. And I think treat it right now, given that we're still learning quite a lot, treat it as an experimental version of AI. And so I think identify use cases where it's safe to experiment. But I would probably hesitate in trying to make an investment where you have pressure now for a certain ROI because you're like, well, we've gone so far in, I need a return. I just think it's very tricky with experimental versions of AI. So I would say, step one, focus on building trust in the data, irrespective of kind of where you're at. Step two, be really intentional about use cases that have to do with your business strategy and sort of where you want to invest your energy and just realizing that you're ultimately trying to invest in a learning mechanism, right? You want to learn from your data, and so people need to be comfortable with that. But then I think the third thing I would say is get to a place where, you treat Gen AI, you treat agentic AI as the experimental kind of technology that it is. And I think if you do that in that way, it's probably, from a starting point, it's probably a good place to start of just sort of how you enter it without hurting yourself too much, I think.
One of the things that we've talked about, you and I, is the employee experience trap, right? In terms of that's something that's very appealing to the HR community in terms of applying AI, to bring a chatbot to the employees to make life easier, et cetera. So it sounds great, but it's hard to build ROI around that, right? So what do you advise, when a CHRO comes to you and is saying like, hey, we want to do AI and we're thinking about employee experience. How do you handle that? What do you say?
I mean, I think one of the things I tend to focus on is it's sometimes less employee experience because employees have a ton of experiences, and so that's probably not what they're scratching at. What they're probably getting at is there's maybe, we like to call moments that matter, but there's probably particular experiences where there's a productivity unlock, where there's, some sort of ground truth in terms of what that employee is going to feel from an engagement perspective. So there's probably specific experiences that we need to always get right. And because the research suggests that, if that employee has a particular experience with us, we're going to get a benefit from it. So I'd probably isolate for those particular experiences and then try to understand what the current state is and why we're bothered with it, right? So that might be something to think about. So I don't know, if we just kept it really simple, an employee expects to get paid every single month, quarter, whatever the setup is, right? If that's a very important experience and in some way it's not happening, but then they also can't get information around it because, I don't know, let's say you're putting in a new payroll system and therefore there's a delay, and when an employee is calling a number to try to get information, they're being routed and they're under stress, and now they're having some knockoff impacts in their personal life, right? All of that's probably not ideal. So there might be opportunities where an AI, solution within a context like that could help. So I think it's probably identifying what are the particular employee experiences that are really important, and then trying to figure out, okay, is there an AI narrative within that really is going to have an impact that's meaningful? Because I think, not every AI initiative is going to be sometimes the sexy, revenue generating, etc. But sometimes those initiatives could be the things that just take pain away, that minimize a certain compliance risk, and so there's like another version of benefit that's also meaningful. So I would tend to advise from the point of view of breaking down, or at least let's try to translate of what we mean by employee experience and what particular experiences maybe we're thinking about, and then have a conversation of like, what is the value of that particular experiencing, right? And so can we find a way to put I don't want to say a price tag on it, but can we find a way to quantify its value? And then we can start to figure out, okay, so now that we know the value of that particular experience, we then know the value of improving it even 10, 15, 20%, right? So I think those are some of the ways in which I take a problem and I just break it down into something tangible. And then suddenly we can all look at it and go, yeah, that's worth our energy. We probably need to get that right.
One of the things that I've observed in the HR domain, and it's somewhat unsurprising because we have been, converging towards what are best practices in HR for a very long time. And when that happens and when it spans decades, we have entire sort of generations of HR leaders that have been trained and optimizing their discipline based on a set of knowns. And just like every other thing that's happening in our world today, I think that a lot of the building blocks of those assumptions are based on different strategic business problems that maybe are still important, but maybe aren't as important as some new emerging business problems. And I think that's where oftentimes we get stuck, because we're sure that our job is in HR is to drive engagement, or we're sure that our job is to increase performance, or we're sure that our job is to make sure that we are executing consistent plans, or focusing on ERGs, or whatever those sorts of proxy actions that were tied to the critical things of the business. Without necessarily being open-minded to the idea that maybe some new things are emerging as more important. And one of those new things that is very top of mind for me, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, is this intersection of what a workforce looks like and what kind of support a workforce needs when it is a hybrid workforce. When there are a richer mix of full-time contingent employees, when there's a richer mix of automation and tooling, when roles and jobs are deconstructed and reconstructed to have different priorities in components. And one of the things that we've used to talk about this in the past was skill, right? Because of course, when most of the things are held the same and there's incremental change over and under, it tended to be a skill problem. Oh, everybody needs to learn how to do video conferencing, or everybody needs to learn how to do hybrid work, or whatever, whatever the skill that we needed. But now we have a multidimensional problem where it's actually an organization design and a work design opportunity. What are you seeing in how an HR leader can have a better conversation, a more data-driven conversation with the business, with the leadership teams, to understand better what is coming on the operations side, and how they can prepare themselves to be that partner that helps think through the redesign of work and the redesign of organizations to maximize work in this moment? Are you seeing any best practices there?
If the conversation with the business is how to get stuff done, I think it has to be a joint effort between an HR person and a tech person, because those are the two kind of levers that would traditionally get stuff done, right? So the HR is talking about the people side of getting stuff done, and they're going to come to you with some sort of talent strategy discussion or workforce plan, and then your tech person is going to come with some element of tooling. And I think in the past they would come at you at different times as you're trying to figure out how to get it done. I think what's happening is those two now have to come together and be in the room with you along with your CFO possibly, depending on that discussion, where you're now going to say, how am I going to, I need to get these things done, how do I do that? And it'll be some mix of, well, from a people perspective it could be this, and then it'll be some mix of, from a technology perspective, it could be that. So I think best practice right now would be those elements coming together. I don't think companies have yet figured out how they've created the workforce or this hybrid workforce that can have both discussions together. I think the future probably will be this hybrid sort of, combination of an HR person who's been upskilled in AI and maybe a tech person who's upskilled in HR, I don't know. But I think right now, you'd have to have those two in the room to have that conversation. I think that's the safest way to do it. I don't think each other specialty knows enough about the other side for it to be a joint, useful conversation yet. But I think I could see that evolving at some point.
And speaking of hybrid roles, I've seen a couple specific examples of dual people and tech leaders emerge, right? I mean, it's still super rare, but it's very interesting because we never would have seen that like 10 years ago, 5 years ago, right? Like, so, but you can see why, because it is such a huge change for the entire organizational structure once you start to look at it from a technology enablement perspective, just completely different. So you and I actually had similar journeys when it came to skills. So we talked a little bit about employee experience, and that was kind of like the area that HR kind of has been focused on. And then over the last 5 years or so, skills has been everywhere, all the time, everywhere. Like everybody's talking about skills. And when we were at SAP and when you were at GSK, in parallel, we were thinking like, okay, how do we figure out future skills? How, what do we need to do? And then at a certain point, we had our revelations that, hey, skills are not the root of the problem. Skills are actually kind of a byproduct of the problem. And the problem is, back to Meg's point, it's the work design. It's, what is actually happening. What was your aha moment? Because you had a very different path than I did in terms of kind of coming, because you were living it, in as an operator. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think, I came from the lens of, we very much were thinking about, the talent marketplace is really where a lot of the story began, right? And so we were like, we want to create, we need a platform or a place where employees who are looking to develop skills, because that's a currency, and managers who are looking for people with skills, we needed a marketplace that they can be. And so I think that was a concept that started off, and skills was like the currency to trade off. And so that was kind of our understanding of like, okay, that makes sense. And then what happens is, we did a pilot with that. Okay, a biopharma trying to enter this space is sometimes complicated, just to give you some context. So you have a portion of your workforce in a lab, in a very controlled lab, and you don't really get to move around too easily because of regulatory dynamics. And then you have a portion of your workforce in a manufacturing space, and again, a lot of constraints. And then you've got the sales force, and then you have desk workers supporting behind. Talent marketplaces probably make sense where mobility is a natural thing and people can move around freely. In environments where that's not the case, it's regulated, it's trickier. So we were probably not the best candidate for kind of marketplace dynamics, but barring that, our understanding of skills or skills data entered because of this dynamic of creating currency that people could use as a way of sort of trading. I think what we quickly realized is, as you sort of moved into moved away from a pilot situation where you're able to test that, skills data is helpful in helping a platform match people, into sort of a full-on implementation where you're trying to now think not just about a platform, but you're actually thinking about how I'm going to run my business, hence this whole skills-first, skills-based language. And when you shift into that dynamic, you suddenly realize this is no longer about a platform anymore. If this is an actual currency, it needs to apply in multiple domains. And what we start to realize is it doesn't apply in multiple domains because it raises more questions than answers. So you'd find situations where, okay, everyone, we just really think intelligently about how we're going to apply, like what skills are needed for a role. Well, given that we, restructure ourselves and that we acquire and we sell off entities, suddenly that's not straightforward. And if you have a room of people debating after 3 months, is this really helpful now, right? How we think about even, this idea of, okay, 2 employees with similar skill sets, and then we're assuming that means that we're gonna have similar outcomes. Well, then they don't have similar outcomes. Well, why is that? And so you're then getting into a situation where you're going to this group of employees and saying, I guess I need to develop you more. And you're going to this group of employees saying, I guess you're due for promotion, and realizing, well, no, there's other dynamics as to why they're successful or not successful that aren't just about skills. And so as you start to really go down this kind of skills-first, skills-based journey in an organization, it's just not straightforward. We had situations where, okay, we had skills data with the role said you needed this skill. The person showed up, they had the skill. We validated, we sent you to a center, we had it validated, yes, you have this skill. We put you in the role, the skill doesn't emerge. How did that happen, right? And so suddenly you're getting into this thing, well, that's really odd because it's been validated and the person can tell you, yes, I do have the skill. What happened? So skills and performance aren't one for one. And so you just start to get to a point where skills data works great in talent marketplaces. And I think it's the currency for those platforms. But skills data in terms of how you're going to run talent is not, talent management is not really what you're after. What you're trying to figure out in those discussions is, I'm a business who needs outcomes and I need task or work delivered. And I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to do it. If it's a person, great. If it's an AI bot, great, also great. But the point is, I have a ton of outcomes I need delivered. HR, tech, can you help me do that? And suddenly you realize the discussion is different. The business is really able to articulate very easily what outcomes they need, but they get into these very difficult challenges of trying to articulate it from a skills perspective because it's so abstract. And sometimes even as difficult trying to tell you it's a tool, because they might even say, I think it's this, they don't know. But what they can easily tell you is what I need to get delivered in order to be successful in my business, these things have to happen. And so I think it's a much easier way for businesses to articulate the outcomes they want. In some cases, get clear on, what the task is. But I think that universe of language is just way more easier when you're trying to operationalize it, because everyone can tell you, any manager can tell you, I just need someone who can do this, right? And that's easier to go, oh, and then tech might say, oh, well, we have something. And then so suddenly everyone can kind of rally around how we get that thing done. And is it always going to be the same outcome? Yes. Oh, well, then we should automate that. Is it going to change parts of it? Okay, well, then yeah. So maybe you need half human, half. But it's just so much easier to get your head around what is the task or outcome I need delivered that everyone can kind of jump in on versus I think it's a skill. And everyone's like, well, what's that? What is that? So I just think, like I said, in a talent marketplace, I totally get it. I think skills data is actually the currency for a talent marketplace where it's designed off of this skills tagging matching dynamic. But I think when you're trying to operationalize in an everyday environment and across an entire kind of talent pipeline, it suddenly gets so difficult to translate. It suddenly is not as straightforward. So I think that's the simplest kind of non-techie way I can describe the experience I had.
Yeah, well, and the talent marketplace is kind of downstream, so it makes sense, right? And then if we take a step back, another white whale in the HR domain has been workforce planning and strategy, right? And so we've because of skills, we kind of entered into this period where it was kind of skills-based workforce planning, and how do we figure out the future skills needed, and then what is our supply of skills and that sort of thing. But again, that's the completely wrong frame when we think about what Meg was saying with regards to it's really about the work design, and then what you were saying, Angela, about really understanding outcomes. And so I think we have a completely a huge evolution or revolution of workforce planning coming as well. And again, this is kind of right in your domain. So I'm super interested in understanding kind of where you see workforce planning going.
Yeah, I think it's going to evolve. I think you're always going to get your kind of top down and bottoms up dynamic. But I think what's interesting with sort of the AI opportunity is because we all kind of appreciate now that it is possible to scale work digitally, whether it's a digital teammate or is it's another way in which your company organizes it. But I think because that's very much a thing now, where there's particular tasks that we know we can delegate to sort of a bunch of agents and string along. I think now it's kind of almost creating what I think about as AI native org design, right? Where you're coming in to the table from the beginning and you're no longer describing, okay, I need to organize. I need to do some sort of reorg, and it's just humans. Your starting point becomes there's a hybrid dynamic to how I'm going to design this. And the reason why I think that has to be true is I don't know if you've ever seen a bunch of agents kind of doing stuff, but it's kind of surreal, and it definitely requires a human in the loop or several and governance and probably an on and off switch because at some point it's stop. So I think this is a skill set that leaders are going to need or managers are going to need because they're going to be accountable for it, right? And so I think you're in a space where if you're designing work with that in mind, that's kind of where the starting point is going to be, which is, okay, team XYZ is responsible to deliver these set of outcomes on a particular schedule, and then it's you're kind of figuring out how they're going to do that, and where do the humans show up, and where does the oversight and all that happen versus where do the agents show up. And I just think there has to be sort of a different lens of how you approach that. That's kind of what I see emerging really quickly. I don't know that everyone's figured it out perfectly, because I think different providers offer different solutions. Some companies are doing this in-house, they're building it themselves in pockets. But I think that's going to be the direction of travel, I think, over the next decade easily.
Going back a little bit to your, moving from skill into the aha moment of what are the outcomes that we need to drive, it really opens up my eyes to the idea that what's happening in that shift is shifting from the language of HR to the language of the business. And I think this is a tool that we do not leverage enough. And I think that it has multiple layers of applicability. But instead of HR going and saying, I know people, I understand the abstraction of skills, and I'm going to tell you all the things I know, start with a little bit of orientation to the business. Help me understand, what are the most important outcomes the business is trying to drive? Where are they are they experiencing bottlenecks, or what Sanjeet would have talked about as coordination costs getting out of hand? Where are we seeing threat in, competition, et cetera, or in customer expectations of those outcomes? And how do we look at that with the lens of what we do know about people and about capability within the organization? So not giving up the goal of deeply understanding what an individual brings, what their strengths are, what their skills are, all of that, but quit thinking that that's the end game, but instead see the role as applying what you know to the business problem of the strategy or the outcomes that are most important. And I think it's that piece and that orientation that is both the opportunity and the missed thing in the middle here, that it isn't that the work on trying to understand skills is bad. It is the fact that it's not speaking the language of the customer, which is the business. And so I think that's where our real opportunity comes in as a group.
What you just said was spot on, because that's exactly the reality. So the aha moment was HR, we were talking talent marketplace language. We didn't have success doing it without skills data. We then went and got skills data. The talent marketplace worked better because of it. We were so excited. We're like, oh my God, this is the answer. And we go to the business and we're like, look, we have all this skills data. The talent marketplace is working. And they're like, what? We don't care about that. Did you get this done? Did we meet these objectives? And they're just like, and they're talking very much the language of outcomes, right? And we were talking the language of, we're trying to do a talent marketplace, or we're trying to move people around, and we're coming with all these metrics of how people are moving and shifting, and we've just got this beautiful HR deck. And they're looking, going, none of this, where's the business, where's the ROI? And they're like, what is this story? And so quite quickly realized their narrative was very much, I'm trying to get these particular things achieved in order to hit a particular number because I'm competing in the market. I have a very tangible outcome that needs to happen in a certain time frame. HR, do you have the talent profile that's going to help me do that? Tech, do you have the technology that's going to enable me to do it? Where are the two of you on that? And we're coming with I got a platform, I got people playing in the platform, and they're like, so I think the aha is really just exactly what you beautifully articulated, which is we have to speak the language of business. And I think what's happened with AI is that it's kind of forcing that now because we can't ignore it. And I think the more HR kind of steps up and says, look, whether it's HR or whether it's tech, I don't know how we define ourselves, but the business is basically saying, I need enablement of some kind. And I think we need to figure out how we enable them. And I think that's the debate that needs to be had. But the focus is very much on the outcome. It's how do we help businesses achieve outcomes? And I think that's what it's always been about. I think because there have been, realistic limitations, we've had to break that problem up into pieces. And so we found ourselves down a particular journey. But I think now there's a consolidation happening where we can be a bit laser sharp in terms of how we tackle it.
That's a beautiful conclusion. Before we completely wrap, anything last that you would like to share, or any advice to give?
I guess, experimentation is probably something that HR functions should be really kind of open to. I think I wouldn't have made these discoveries or these learnings if we didn't experiment. And so I think, not every experiment means you get to an outcome that is like, yes, we've solved it. I think sometimes the most important value is in the learning and in recognizing that, oh, okay, actually, yes, there's a role to play with skills or skills data, but actually I need to go a bit further and I need to think about this even more holistically. So I would just say, there's no sort of bad pilot, or there's no bad experiment necessarily, unless people get hurt, of course, maybe that's different. But I think the learning is part of the journey, and if you're honest, that's kind of what AI is, right? You're constantly learning about things anyway. So I would say, yeah, if there's a final message, it's just experimentation is good. I think experiment, what they say, fail fast, learn and then grow.
Thank you, Angela, for that. We really appreciate it. And it has been a delightful learning opportunity for Amy and I. So thank you so much for coming on the Meg and Amy Show.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been so fun. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Here's our question. I am a recent college graduate, and I currently work with a group of significantly older individuals. Though I have more experience in the specific domain, they never take my advice. How do I get people 40 to 50 years my senior to listen and take me seriously?
That's a tough one, right? Oh my gosh. Being underestimated and having people be dismissive of something you know more about than them is...
That's never happened to you, Meg, has it?
I was going to say, it's been, it's possible. I've experienced that one or two times myself. So a couple things. Kind of the first thing that comes to mind is a little bit of understanding of what's going on. Oftentimes when you are more experienced and you have skills that people that have been doing something for a while or feel themselves to be experienced do not have, they tended to dismiss it in general as unimportant because most of us are sort of self-focused. And so if I don't have that skill, it must not be an important skill because look at how far I've come or how much life I've experienced. And that's been fine. So kind of by definition, they're biased to assuming that their expertise has a higher weight than yours. And so there's kind of two things to think about in this situation from my point of view. Number one is you have to not be surprised this happens. I think the first part is really often it's frustrating. And if you let yourself get fixated on the frustration, it's going to make it harder for you to get done whatever else you need to get done. And you also probably need to let go the idea that you're going to turn them into people that value you the way that you deserve to be valued. And I think then you put yourself into the everything is figure outable mode and start to ask yourself, what are some paths to unlock the important parts, not the annoying parts, but the important parts that you do need them to take on board. And usually this requires a combination of inception, so maybe trying to figure out how to get the idea out there without putting so much directness to it. And then oftentimes maybe even building a proxy of somebody else bringing that idea forward. It's frustrating because it's your idea and you know it'll work and you're the one that has the value to share and add. But unfortunately, oftentimes, if it matters to get done, if you need it to happen, you probably need someone else to bring it forward. So either find one of the people that are doing pushback and seeing if you can pull them aside and incept the idea into them, or maybe even lean on somebody that already has the credibility and let them kind of help bring that idea forward on your behalf. Amy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think over time, people's curiosity generally starts to go down, and that's something that a lot of people try to prevent, but it's just the natural tendency because you feel like you know everything and you've done everything and you're not so curious about all the new things. So in terms of maybe finding that, person or two that can be maybe your channel. So I would look for the curious. Where do you see people that are curious about the topics that you are speaking of? And now maybe they're still not giving you credit for it or really, really fully listening, but they're, at least there's some curiosity there. Then I would focus on building a relationship directly with that person and getting their curiosity wet. So again, not necessarily like lecturing, not pushing, but just being curious about their curiosity and, where you might be able to help them with that. This is a concept called reverse mentoring, where, an older, maybe, more experienced and general person actually, is mentoring a younger person in terms of like the ways of life. And then that older person is getting mentorship from the younger person in terms of like technology or new techniques, etc. And it's a really nice like two-way, right? But the key there is that you can't just be pushing up. You also have to kind of accept the mentorship down as well for them probably to accept the reverse mentorship up. So it sounds a little complicated, and you might want to look up reverse mentoring. But I think that's a really great strategy to find that kind of person and that sort of relationship. And that can be really rewarding in and of itself. But what you can also do then is have that person then, really kind of tout to the others, how great that's been, what they've learned from you, what new techniques they're leveraging because of what they've learned from you. And that can be a way to kind of spread that more broadly across the organization.
I would just add one other thing that comes to mind. And again, you can tell this is super tough. You're not going to really win. You're just going to find ways to reduce the frustration and the loss and the stress of it all. But one technique that really matters and is helpful in trying to foster and develop curiosity is to ask them questions versus giving them advice and answers. So help them build that path, that train of thought path to your idea, as opposed to telling them the answer. That might open up a path for them to be more receptive, because then it truly is their idea. It's just you nudged them all the way there, which is usually how you have to do it in the early days.
Wonderful.
Great question. Thanks for bringing a new question to us, and do keep it up, people. It's really helpful for us to have really tough, gnarly questions. It makes us think, which is good.
Well, this has been a great episode. Angela was a fantastic guest. What did we learn today, Meg?
The more I reflect on kind of these patterns that we're seeing, the more it just becomes really clear to me that these siloed, very specific, hyper-specialized roles are going away in a lot of different areas, and they're going away very quickly. And the need is for these higher order, bigger context type roles that bring together the pieces that used to be individual smaller roles. So this, I think, talks to the compression of entry-level roles and all of the stress we're thinking about where the transition of work is. But even more, I think it reminds us that anybody in the middle that wants to see these new opportunities, you have to be open to the idea that you have to think more broadly about the skills that you need to bring to the table to be able to capture the kind of jobs that are going to be of interest in the future. So everybody's either going down a level or going to have to dramatically upskill to meet the need of the moment. You're just not going to be able to stay where you are and have the same value. It's just not, I don't see a math that makes that work.
And it comes back to that book that we really liked a few years back, Range. Remember that one where It really talked about Back then it spurred our desires for talent marketplaces to give people lots of different experiences. So it all comes full circle, right? But I think, just being able to, put yourself into new uncomfortable situations and to gain different perspectives is going to be really huge.
Future is interesting, but it is not the same as it is today. So, I think this just reinforces more and more that we together need to invent the future. So let's invent the future together, everyone. I believe in us.
And let's make every day count.